Hello and welcome to the Reactive Dog Pod. I am your host, Tess Morgan. I am a multi-certified dog behavior consultant who specializes in the treatment of reactivity in dogs. Through my business, Treat Yourself Dog Training and Behavior, I help clients make progress and enjoy life again with their reactive dogs. Join me and my guests as we dive into all things reactivity. We'll explore behavior concepts, talk about real-life training plans and considerations for reactive dogs, provide tips and tricks, and discuss how we can best help reactive dogs and their families thrive. Because reactive dogs are good dogs, they just need a little bit of extra support. Let's get into it. I'm excited to dive into our topic today, as I think it's one that affects almost every reactive dog guardian at some point. And my guests, I'm sure, will have lots of helpful information for you to take with you as you search for daycares or pet care providers for your pups. Today, we'll be talking about dog daycare and other pet care options for reactive dogs. But before we begin, let me introduce you to my guest today. Amy Terceira is the owner and trainer at Dog Gone Good Bermuda. She started as a professional groomer and then switched gears to dog behavior full-time. Amy graduated from the Academy for Dog Trainers and Julie Naismith's Separation Anxiety Pro Behavior Consultant course. That's a mouthful. She's also studied under clinical animal behaviorist Sarah Whitehead in the UK. Amy has been running weekly play groups for over 11 years and runs a private hire dog park in Bermuda. She does a lot of private training work, specializing in fear, anxiety, and reactivity. She has a particular interest in dog body language and play and how health affects behavior. Stefania Butkovic owns and operates Mindful Mutts, a one-of-a-kind, low-stress group dog daycare and positive puppy and dog training company located in New Westminster, BC. Stefania has been studying in many different avenues to learn all about dogs. She is studying to become a certified science-based dog trainer and regularly attends seminars and courses in an effort to stay up to date in her field of work and to continue her education in the science behind dog behavior. Thank you for being here, both of you.
Nice to be here.
So before we get started, I was hoping you could each introduce yourselves. I know I just introduced you, but just a little bit more personal information about your own dogs and whether you've ever dealt with reactivity with your dogs. And if not, if you work with reactive dogs professionally. So let's start with Amy. Do you want to introduce yourself and your dogs?
Hi, yes. I do a lot professionally with reactive dogs. It's quite a common case that I get. And I have two dogs, Albert and Tessa, two border terriers. Tessa, she's 7. She is reactive, and I've done a lot of work with her. She's reactive due to anxiety, so it's not frustration. And I think it's a really, it's an interesting case type, but it's also hard because it's really a process. But I do enjoy it.
And I know you've been doing a lot of work on Tessa's reactivity.
Yes, I have. And I've also reached out to others for help too, other professionals and a veterinarian.
Important. Steph, can you introduce yourself and your dog?
Yeah, sure. I have now one dog, but prior to a couple months back, we actually lost our reactive dog.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that. She was a little over 12 and a half, and we've had her for just over a decade. And I think that the most interesting thing that I can share about having a reactive dog, as someone who didn't realize what a reactive dog was when she first came home to us, was that I really had no idea she was reactive or what that meant or where it stemmed from. It was a really confusing time in our family because she was only like 1 or 2 years old when we brought her home, and we had another small dog at home already at the time. And the knowledge that I had prior to that was like, I had a really easygoing, very happy little Lhasa puppy for several years prior to her. And the Min Pin that I currently still have now is so chill and so easygoing. She gets a little barky, but like it's not, it's not anything. Yeah, it's a min pin. She's also crossed with Chihuahua. It just is her life. Um, and so coming from a place where I had only these two little dogs who were like able to come with me everywhere, like on a bus, to like when I started getting into working with animals, coming to classes with me, doing public events. And then suddenly I had this dog who was very calm and quiet for the first like few days of her life with us. And then it was just like, bam, our whole entire world's turned upside down, which was at the end of the day, I think it was for the best. I got to learn a lot about dogs. I got pushed into the direction professionally that I got pushed into because of her. But nobody really tells you how to understand what a reactive dog is, why they're reactive, how to go from having a life without reactivity to a life where every aspect of every day revolves around their needs, which is fine. But I think for a lot of people, I think even professionally coming from a place now where I'm trying to wrap my head around like what are the family experiencing and do they feel okay with that, because it's a lot of time and a lot of extra dedication and energy and financial commitment sometimes. And so Bruna, she passed away in, I believe it was March of this year, but she had as good a life as she was possibly going to have, and I feel pretty darn good about that. But that was the biggest 10-year learning curve I could have ever expected.
Yeah, thank you for telling that story, especially when it's so fresh with her loss. I think every trainer that, or almost every trainer that ends up working with reactivity, were pushed into the career because of a reactive dog, right? And it's so
Heck
true.
yes.
Like, we're all kind of like, dog people. And even for me, like having to arrange my life around my reactive dog is challenging. So you can't even imagine for someone who's like, I didn't sign up for like intense dog training,
Totally.
Yep.
Thank you both for sharing that. I want to start our conversation by talking about daycare as a concept for reactive dogs. I think we've all had experiences with witnessing the fallout from badly run dog daycares, which can include dogs becoming fearful, anxious, reactive. And so I want to talk about whether daycare is ever a suitable option for a reactive dog, because we know that if there's daycares like Stefania's, then there are good daycares out there that are trying to prioritize welfare. And we also want to think about the fact that some dogs are reactive because they're frustrated that they're not getting access to other dogs, and not everyone has a play group or something, or a playmate that they can expose their dog to. And so my first question that I'm going to put out there is whether the dog is anxious, fearful, or frustrated. Is it ever suitable to put a reactive dog in a daycare? Steph, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think that there's so much nuance to a question like that I don't really know exactly where to start. So I'm just going to start and let it go rolling off the tongue here. But I really think that the word reactive doesn't do enough for me as far as like choosing whether a dog is right for our play groups. We got to break that down into so many different layers. Now, if the dog is reactive and it is going to cause physical danger to them or to another dog or to a person that is on site, that would probably not be a dog that I could have, because it would mean that safety is not being a priority. But that being said, if a dog is or has at some point been labeled as reactive, I find that owners a lot of the time may not know what exactly that word necessarily means if you're coming from a trainer's perspective, or maybe like a behavioral perspective, because I think that some dogs being like, I don't know, we had like a tiny little chat before we started here, and you mentioned that there was a dog who's like afraid of rain. And so I've had dogs come to us specifically because they love to play with other dogs, but they are reactive to like the environment of the outdoors, whether it's rain or trees or wind. And so it was very challenging for their families to be able to take them even just for like a walk around the block. Whereas if they came to us, they had a regular group of friends that they would play with, they would get to know each other, they'd get their walks to some degree. Maybe they're just pee breaks in the yard, stuff like that, that we could accommodate to match what that dog specifically individually needs. And then on that note, I think about, does that take away from the other animals that are in our care at the time if we have to put that much more effort and energy into this one dog when there are a dozen others we have to consider? So I think that there is a time and a place, and perhaps even if a dog is reactive to or has the label of being reactive, maybe our daycare isn't the right facility specifically. Maybe it's the layout, maybe it's I don't know, maybe it's the neighborhood. There could be another one out there that might be better suitable just because of that aspect. So I think that there's so much nuance to that, which is why I figured I'd just kind of start somewhere and take it from there. But I guess that's my answer, is that yes, there's a place for some animals and some families that need that source of care or enrichment or both for their pet in a group environment.
Mm-hmm. I think that's such a good point, because the tricky thing about daycares is that there may be one that's like out in the country that doesn't have the city noise or construction or all of the triggers, but it
Yeah.
may not be well run, or may not
Or
be,
accessible
yeah, or accessible to people. Exactly.
if you got to
And then
drive
there
out an
may,
hour to get there.
exactly. Yeah. Not everyone has a car. And then there may be a really well-run daycare like yours that is in an area that's going to be really difficult for the dog. Yeah.
Yeah, and it could be in a more densely like populated area, which can be tough for a lot of dogs to live in a city, especially like so many dogs that we've cared for in the past have come from um, like spaces, homes from further out, living in like I don't know. I mean, I guess Tess would be familiar with like the Fraser Valley, which is like a little farther. There's more distance between houses. And there's not such a densely populated like neighborhood like we have here in Westminster or in Vancouver in general. And so when they come into like the city environment, it is a huge shock for them. And that alone can be like just challenging for a family to navigate. So it might even mean that the daycare environment isn't forever, it's temporary until they get their bearings and can find a way to live comfortably in their new environment. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
That's a good point. Amy, do you have anything you want to add about reactive dogs and suitability for daycare?
Yeah, I think the label reactive should be probably clarified
Mm-hmm.
just to start, like
Mm-hmm.
when you're deciding about daycare, we need to really define what your dog is going through, what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times people call aggressive dogs reactive, and that's quite inaccurate, right? So
Yeah.
obviously, a dog that struggles with other dogs in that way and is causing injury maybe shouldn't be at daycares for the liability. But I think there's a difference between anxiety versus frustration. I know my dog Tess is would be very unsuitable for daycare because she's too anxious and it would be too overwhelming for her. She actually wants to create distance from dogs, not go to them. So for her, it would be awful. But I guess if you have maybe a young adolescent dog that is struggling with frustration and they don't have enough access to off-lead time with other dogs and they're friendly, it could work. But I think the key is that it has to be run well. Um, Basically because we know that frustration, too much of it is not a good thing. And if it's not handled well, it could even tip to anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would be the key is the dog anxious or frustrated? Are they friendly with other dogs? Do they actually want to be with other dogs? And is the daycare run well?
Mm-hmm.
I
And
would be worried about the frustrated dog.
yeah, yeah,
I would never send an anxious dog to daycare, but a frustrated dog, it would really have to be someone that understands dog body language. They know what they're doing, and they know that the feeling of frustration shouldn't be prolonged all day long.
Mm-hmm.
A little bit here and there, yeah, that's doable, but all day long, I would feel that that's not of benefit to the dog.
Well, that actually it goes perfectly into what I was thinking, because while you were talking, I was thinking about how reactive dogs, a lot of the time when I'm working with them, it's like they can handle another dog for a couple seconds or a minute or something, but they don't want prolonged exposure to other dogs. And like, if we think about the idea of threshold and the dog staying relaxed and under threshold, they will be under threshold and be fine for a certain period of time, but they're going to the pot's going to boil over if they're with that dog for too long.
Yeah. Duration is key. Rest is key. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. The other point I wanted to make about suitability of daycare, Steph touched on a little bit with dogs who are sensitive to noise, or wind or other things in their environment where they're not dog reactive. And so the issue isn't that they're aggressive or reactive to other dogs. It's that maybe the environment is too hard. There's also dogs who are reactive to strangers. And so trying to introduce a dog who is scared and barking at strangers into a group care situation, I imagine would be very difficult, right? I do have a client who goes to a daycare who has issues with strangers, and he loves the daycare providers. They've done a good job kind of integrating him, but that's something else that we should take into account, right? It's not just dog reactivity. There's also dogs that don't like strangers or are scared of strangers.
Yeah, if our staff have trouble with like actually being able to leash a dog to take them out, or like to approach them and keep them like feeling like they're in a warm, comfy, cozy space, then that does get challenging for it's challenging for us, but it's like if we can't actually facilitate that physically for the dog, then it's not really helping. That's also like kind of debatable, to be honest with you, because there are some dogs who they'll just, it's not very maybe common. It's not the everyday thing that we encounter, but there are dogs who will play, sleep, go for their walks, but like really don't want general interaction. So we just don't interact with them as the person because they just really want to be with the dog. I don't know if that even makes sense, but I throw that in there while it was at the top of my mind.
Yeah, for sure. So we've talked about whether daycare is suitable at all for reactive dogs. And we've also talked about like reactive as a label, and we need to actually look at the dog as an individual and not make blanket statements about like a reactive dog. I think we use reactivity just to like help people kind of understand what we're talking about, because people generally understand reactive dogs are going to be barking and lunging is like the idea of a reactive dog. So now that we've talked about that, I want to talk about more about like actually telling whether a daycare is a good daycare or is maybe not so well run. How do we tell if a daycare is well managed? As someone who maybe has just adopted a dog, realizes they're struggling with a bit of reactivity, maybe thinks they're might be a suitable candidate for a daycare, but they don't know how to pick a daycare, and there's like a million daycares out there. I know from personal experience, not to throw daycares under the bus, but like I find that there's more questionable ones than ones that I feel comfortable sending dogs to. So what I was hoping is that Steph, you can tell us a little bit about how you manage mindful mutts to ensure that the program is as low stress as possible, prioritizes the dog's welfare, and also how you kind of like make sure the dog is suitable to be there.
Sure. So I'll start off by saying that just because we do things a certain way, or just because we refer to ourselves in a certain way, like low stress, for example, the low stress actually comes from like several of us, including myself, are low stress certified from like years ago when that was like a big thing. Maybe not a big thing, but it was the only thing maybe at the time that we could kind of do. There's like a lot of options these days. But just because we are those things doesn't mean that I personally advertise that there's like perfection involved, because it's not possible for like a human being, let alone for an animal, to be like under like a no fear all day, perfectly happy, all those kinds of things. So as a daycare owner, I just want to stress that so that when I'm talking about this stuff, that I'm not like unaware of that fact. So one thing I did want to share was that I recently spoke to somebody who had worked at a daycare that had over 150 dogs. And I think it was like 2 or 3 people were working. They also had other species of animals in the building, including overnight. The first thing that I'm going to tell you is just from my experience that like anything more than like a dozen animals in a facility is very, very hard to make a low stress experience. That being said, I'm a business and we have to try and figure things out and maneuver and readjust the room and readjust our space and how we do things constantly. It's not like we don't have like a checklist that we can follow exactly on a day-to-day basis because it depends on the dogs that are in that day. It depends. Our staff are pretty reliable, so I'm pretty confident in like usually knowing that our staff are going to be like there for their shifts, which is manageable because we don't have 150 animals. So that alone is terrifying to think about, just from my perspective of what I do on a daily basis and have done for a decade. A dozen dogs is already a lot of management. More than that requires extra vigilance, extra everything, extra time. Everything is extra consideration for how you divide up the room and which play groups you put together. Extra time for considering how many walks we can offer in that day, extra time for pee breaks, extra time for puzzles, extra time for all of those things. So there's a lot of consideration involved for any amount of animals that are more than one, let alone then that many. For let's say 15 dogs in a day, we will generally have, for the most part, 2 people working, oftentimes 3, or at least in some overlapped manner. In addition to that, we ask our clientele to help us out to some degree. So we ask them to bring their dogs snacks. We ask them to bring them special chews if they're going to need some time to chill out, but maybe have a little bit of a hard time chilling out when they know there's so much going on in the environment. We also ask our wonderful clientele to make sure that their dogs go potty before they come into the building so that we can maintain a clean building through the day versus having to keep up with cleaning all day. We don't want to send dogs home covered in stuff. And I mean, they're dogs, so expecting them to not all day long have not one accident indoors is a lot to ask for. But when you have a certain amount of animals and you have a certain amount of people, you're able to stay on top of that cleanliness in a much easier manner. That's not stressful. And that's another key to the low stress part, is that we want it to be not stressful for us either. Because if we're listening to barking and cleaning up pee pee and poo poo all day long, that will get to you at some point. So the number of animals in the facility, the ratio of people to dogs within reason is something that I would consider, just for safety issues, but also for cleanliness is important. And having a community understanding. So it's not just that we're a business and that you bring your dogs to us and pay for a service that we provide and you go. For me personally, I find that it's easier to manage and run things in a safe manner when we get to know the people behind the dogs and we have a connection with those people, so that we have communication about what the dog's needs are, if they're different from any other dogs. And a lot of the time it will be, because dogs are individuals, and sometimes that can be a wrench in your plan for the day. And sometimes those dogs, when they're having good days, most of the time they will have a bad day once in a while, and knowing how to like manage that for them too. So there's a lot to consider for environmental stuff when it comes to that. Um, I just also want to say I don't remember where it comes from. I know at some point I actually heard it in like a webinar or something, but someone somewhere said that the behaviors in the environment. I don't remember who said that, but that literally plays on a loop in our heads all day, every day. Because if there's something happening and dogs are getting more amped up, what is it that's affecting those dogs? So body language knowledge um, is really necessary. Like you can't, I don't think, do this job without having some core understanding of how a dog's brain works and what they're trying to tell us with their bodies. And there's no requirement for that. And there's no specific like checklist or certification or whatever that encompasses everything. Mm-hmm. And so it's up to every individual human being as the consumer to just do their own due diligence and see, what the not qualifications, I don't like to use that word very much, but what the daycare themselves as human beings have to offer as far as that goes. Mm-hmm. I get a little bit like, I think frustrated when I have to even think about the fact I try to stay in my own world where we're peace, love, and happiness, and we do our thing with like our small group of animals and our little community of clientele. But it really like makes me feel sick when I think about 150 animals under one roof. So it immediately starts to affect me emotionally. So I'm trying to like find the words to come back from that, but I couldn't not share that because that was just like something sort of recent. I have others who I've spoken to over years where they had 100 dogs in one space, one person working. They got hurt on the job and weren't able to leave because they couldn't leave the dogs unattended, and the owner of the space was not bothered by that. And things are like accidents can happen. They just can and they will, quite frankly, because they're dogs. They have teeth and nails. And if you're not watching really closely and really intently, things can definitely not go the way that you're planning for them to go. But having an understanding of what you're dealing with and having enough eyes and hands on hand will help with whatever it is that you're trying to get through a day. And so I think that that's like one of the biggest things for me is just that there can't be 100 dogs in a space. Yeah.
One thing I remember about mindful months, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember that there's like drop off and pickup time so the dogs aren't disturbed all day by people ringing the doorbell and coming in.
That's true. Yeah, we have specific drop off times and specific pickup times, and we even ask for like approximate pickup times. It can change. Our clients will text us and let us know that traffic's really bad or they got stuck at work. But that helps us to like change again the environment, right? Like if all the dogs are excited to see a leash grabbed and like they're like, oh, it's time to go out for a walk or it's time to go home to my people or whatever, that's a lot of energy in the room, and that's a lot of dogs getting amped up in one space. So it is important to be able to facilitate with any number of dogs, knowing how to safely get them in and out of the facility. So, and a lot of the times, like that means leashes. Sometimes it doesn't mean leashes. Sometimes it means, getting them out from one side of a gate to another gate and then getting them out to another section before you can leash them safely so that, I mean, like we said so many times now, they're all individual beings. And so, I think that it's so important to get to know every individual animal for who they are and for what their special requirements are in that day to be able to provide a safe system in coming and going through the facility, and drop off and pickup times definitely help. We also don't have walk-ins whatsoever. So you can't come in. There was a good amount of time when we first opened for the first couple of years that people would constantly insist on coming inside to see puppies playing. And I get it. I do. Dogs are cute. We want to see them enjoying themselves. But we started to get much more strict. And I know that that sometimes is also a tough thing to navigate because we want people to be able to see within our space and know that dogs are being handled safely, but at the same time, like we can't have everyone on display all day for the dogs, but also for the people. I think that that's a interesting thing. So yeah, drop off and pickup times, it just comes again into management of the dogs and how you can't work. I don't think you can possibly do this job safely if you don't invest your time into understanding how they communicate and how to communicate with them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think we could talk about this forever because you have a lot of stuff going on at your daycare that's like worth diving into. But in the interest of time, let's give Amy a chance to weigh in on this.
Cut me off.
Amy, how do you? I know you have opinions on daycare in general, but if you have a client who is at a daycare or who is considering a daycare, what do you look for in terms of like, is this a daycare that's worth checking out, or is this a daycare that we should avoid?
Yeah, so Stefania touched on qualifications. That's hard to sort of define in this industry, right?
Yeah.
What would qualify someone appropriately to run a daycare? We have more clear qualifications for dog trainer, behavior consultant, right? So, what course should they take? I don't even have the answer to that, but I would like to see them have some basic knowledge on dog behavior and especially body language.
Totally.
And also probably wrangling skills as well. But, what course is there for that? I don't know the answer. So a couple of things that I would look for is dog to human ratio. So, if it's 25 dogs to one human, that's a big no-no for me. It really, in my opinion, 6 to 8 maximum to one human. That I would even like less, but that's a different, it depends the dogs, I suppose, the age of them and stuff. Intake form do they have a good intake form? What are the questions on the intake form? Some don't even have intake forms. The assessment, how do they do the assessment? How do they let the dogs enter the daycare? I have some here that I know of that don't really have protocol around that. They've got dogs loose in a fenced area, and a dog and person coming in just comes right in to this group of loose dogs. And that's a big no-no for me too, because they'd get rushed and could be very threatening. So that would be another thing I'd look at. Cleanliness, Stefania touched on, and how they control the group. So, what if they have to interrupt? How do they do it? What tools do they use? What's their policy on controlling the group, on breaking up things that need to be broken up? If they're using spray bottles and shake cans and anything aversive, that would be a big no-no for me too. So
Okay.
yeah, that's what I was making notes while Stefania was talking.
I was going to say
thing. I really love that you mentioned that. I totally forgot about that. And sorry to interrupt you, Tess. I said I wasn't going to do that, and then I did it. The interrupter, you said something about like interrupting the group, how to like manage the group. That part is so important. I've had somebody in the past that like everything was like working out like well as a staffer, and then when I was around, but then when I would leave the room, other staffers would tell me like this dog was acting like a certain way, so this person would like pick up the dog and put them on a table, and the dog would just stop doing things. And so that didn't last very long because like I said, like we have a very like dedicated, reliable crew for the most part. And so they put a stop to that very quickly, and like we dealt with it. But like that alone, like even that was honestly, it was kind of like a misunderstanding on the person's, side of like how to manage a group, and how to stop a behavior from happening that they didn't love happening. But it was like so unkind and unnecessary in the way that they managed it. Luckily taking like the critique of it to like well and whatnot, and like learning how to do something better. But Yeah, spray bottles are so normal. I didn't know how normal those were in daycares. It doesn't
Yeah.
even make sense to me. Um, we use just like a lot of that, a lot of sounds with your mouth. I
Yeah.
mean, when you get to know the dogs really well, right? Like if you have a multi-dog household, you get kind of like good at like getting their focus on you and spending because you spend time with them and they learn what the routines are. So yeah, I think that like that is such an important part that I didn't even think to mention.
Amy?
One more thing I just thought of. I think people that are considering daycare should make a list of questions, right? Everything we discussed just now, so
Mhm.
the human to dog ratio, qualifications, how do they control the group? All that stuff should be asked to the daycare. And if the daycare struggles to answer any of that, that would be a big red flag for me. You want them to have
Totally.
all of this known already, and be able to answer your questions easily and with transparency.
Yes. Okay. Before we move on to the next question, I want to add a couple things that either I heard when you guys were talking or just I was thinking about while you were talking. Steph, I loved how you said the behavior is like a product of its environment, right? I think that's such a poignant thing to say about daycare because if we have an environment that is conducive to dog fights and dogs being stressed out and dogs being bullied or cornered or overwhelmed, then that's what we're going to get. Right. And so, like, if the environment is not set up for the dogs to be successful, then there's just no way that they're going to have a good experience at daycare. Amy, you touched on this a little bit in terms of interrupting the dogs, but training methods in general, like what is your policy about training methods? We want to look for a daycare that's positive reinforcement based. I've heard of daycares throwing shock collars on dogs without telling the client or dialing up the shock collar really high without telling the client. I mean, everyone in this group is not on board with shock collars ever, but I remember when I heard that, I was thinking, well, even if I was okay with putting an e-collar on, to completely dial up the level of the e-collar is like completely unacceptable. I also thought there was an interesting point about dogs getting amped up, like when someone's coming to pick one of the dogs up, because we know that when dogs get amped up and bottleneck in a certain area, that can cause issues in dog fights, right? So if that's not managed well, then that can cause a really bad experience and then potentially lead to reactivity if the dog has a bad enough experience. And then I also wanted to touch on, because I don't think we talked that much about suitability. So I always tell people like the daycare should be telling you if your dog is not enjoying daycare. And there's a lot of daycares that will continue to take your money and not tell you, or maybe they're just not proficient enough at body language to even really tell if the dog is scared. But like I remember with my dog, before she became reactive, we were sending her to like a group dog walking, and they had like a private rented outside area, and they would throw all the dogs in, and there was like a couple dog walkers that were coming to the same area, so they would like share it. And the dog walker told me, oh, she loves to greet everyone. She runs up to everyone and barks in their face when they enter the area. And I was like, is that like a greeting, or is that her freaking out and panicking? So that's really important. So if we do go to a daycare, we find a well-managed daycare, how do we tell if a daycare is benefiting the dog or if it's harming them? So what would you look for if someone was asking you as a client, my dog's going to daycare, but I'm not sure if it's a good thing for them. I'm not sure like if they're benefiting from it. Do either of you want to go first?
I
I
have
will.
things to say.
Oh, Steph, why don't you go first?
Whatever order is good with me. Okay, so something that pops into my mind anytime I talk about that is that this comes back to like my relationship, or I guess like our team's relationship with clientele, is that we will on our end never know how it's affecting your dog outside of our environment. We might know that your dog comes in, has fun, takes a nap, does whatever they need to do in their day, and just seems like a relatively like standard normal day. But if it's changing things on their end, we want them to tell us, because we'll consider that and be like maybe this isn't working then, because what I think a lot of the time, even if you're running things as well as you can, even if you're putting in all of your heart and energy and time and um, dedication to like the animal's well-being and welfare, we will never know the dogs the same way that the humans that bring them home at the end of the day know them. So that communication is really important for the professionals on our end, but with the clientele. And I say that because there's a lot of nuance there, and there's a lot of like, there's terminology that's used like professionally that we get used to using when we're talking to each other about stuff, and then there's converting that into like what your clients are hearing and understanding, because I think that changes a lot of things on I think it just changes things in how people understand what's going on. So from our perspective, just from what I do, I always want to know if something is affecting their dog outside of daycare. If nothing's changing in what we feel like is a connection between the two of like regular life and coming to daycare, but there are other changes in their daily life could also affect how their dog is changing when they come to us. So in general, communication about changes in behavior are important. Um, I'm sure that there are plenty of lists of things that we'll go over, like as far as like specifics, but I just really wanted to note that. And now I'm more interested, I think, to hear what the two of you have to say on the topic, because it will kind of refresh for me, what I need to know as the person behind that part of it. But anyways, I thought that was important to note.
Amy, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, great point about communication. I'm not sure how many daycares actually do that. So I seriously, I think it's really important, and that the guardian should know that is best practice. It's like when you send a toddler to nursery, you're communicating with what's going on.
Exactly. I love that.
Yeah, totally. So what would your question was, what would be
How would you know if the dog, like if the person,
yes, okay.
the person's dog is going to daycare, how would you know if they should continue taking their dog, if it's benefiting them or if it's maybe not benefiting them so much?
Yeah, so it's definitely if reactivity develops, I would be concerned about what's going on in the daycare. I'd want eyes on it. Deterioration of play skills or a development of a play skill deficit. Let's say an increase in bullying behavior or targeting behavior, because probably they're practicing that at daycare. If it's increasing, it's getting reinforced. Exhaustion, are they coming home completely exhausted and just dead to the world? That would concern me. I don't think that's really healthy. So I'd want to maybe make some changes there. And then maybe something also like hyperactivity. Is the dog able to settle, or are they just struggling to relax? That would make me wonder what is going on at daycare.
The weird thing is that just like toddlers, like overtired toddlers, dogs can be hyperactive when they're actually super tired.
Yeah.
Totally.
Totally. And it's not fun. Yeah. It's not fun for the guardian.
No.
Exhausted was on my list too. Like dead, like one thing to be tired from playing all day, and it's another thing to be completely exhausted where like they're sleeping the entire evening because they just like can't seem to do anything else. Because we know that can be a stress thing, right? Recovering from stress, you need to sleep to recover from the stress. And we also know that a lot of daycares, the dogs are not going to be getting the amount of sleep that we want them to be getting during the day, and that not enough sleep can impact all kinds of behavior, including reactivity and the likelihood of reactivity. The other thing I look at is trends. So like, has any type of behavior trended better or worse since they've been going to daycare? If we have a frustrated dog that we're sending to daycare because we're hoping that it will help with their frustration reactivity, then hopefully combined with training, that reactivity is going to be trending better. If their reactivity is trending worse, then that's something that I'd be concerned about, or any behavior that either we don't like or that is negatively impacting the dog. I also have some clients where they're getting into a lot of scuffles at daycare. And I think there's a difference between like normal dog communication where you're allowed to kind of have an argument. But if there's scuffles every single time they're going or multiple times, or if the scuffles are increasing in terms of like the severity of injuries, I would be concerned about that. Another thing that's interesting is that a lot of people think that like, oh, my dog is so excited to go to daycare, so that's a really good sign. And the interesting thing is that sometimes anxiety can look like excitement. It can present in similar ways. And so we have to look at the whole picture and not just assume that the dog is really excited. We also can have conflict where the dog is excited to go, but they're also having a hard time too. And a lot of dogs just present in that weird, kind of erratic, excited looking way when they're feeling conflicted or anxious. The other thing I wanted to mention is with reactivity, we talk a lot about like preventing the practice of the reactive behavior. And Amy, we were talking recently about a daycare local to you where the dogs are just barking all day at the fence kind of thing. And so if the dog is barking a lot at daycare, especially if they're barking at things or at their triggers a lot at daycare. So if they're leaving the dog out in a yard and the dog's just barking at cars going by or dogs or whatever, that's not going to help you with your reactivity progress. So you want to think about like, is the daycare experience helping me make progress with this, or is it working against me? And I also wanted to touch on what you said, Amy, with the bullying, play skills deficit, targeting. So just wanted to define it just in case someone doesn't understand kind of what we're talking about. So bullying is pretty obvious, right? So that would just mean a dog where they seem to like pick on certain dogs and not leave them alone. Play skill deficit. So as trainers, we talk about play skills, meaning that there's like healthy things that dogs do during play, like having a back and forth with their play where they're equally kind of participating, changes in activity, certain what we call meta signals, which are essentially like body language signs that it's helpful, not helpful, healthy play. And so when Amy was talking about play skills deficit, it's just if the dog starts to not kind of show that healthy play behavior. So my next question, actually, did either of you have anything else to add about that, about daycare helping or harming a dog?
I think we covered most of it or all of it.
Sorry if I'm just listing things off.
I'm
I just
on board.
have all my points that I'm thinking of when you're talking. I had a question. I don't know if you're going to have the answer to this because this is kind of a difficult troubleshooting question. But one of the things that came to mind when I was preparing for this episode is frustrated dogs that would benefit from play. It can be really difficult because when that dog is on leash, they may be very reactive and then they may not be reactive off leash. And a lot of trainers will do parallel walks where we very slowly kind of walk together and work on training together and do a very slow introduction. Steph, do you have any like experience with dogs who are like that, where they're really frustrated coming in and you have to kind of have a special protocol to get them in without the reactivity?
I'm going to say yeah, because I think that for the most part, coming into like a place that is like kind of doggy Disneyland will bring out all sorts of emotions in a dog. And so I'm not going to say no, but I also don't want that to make it sound like we just only take in reactive dogs all day without considering what their needs are, right? But I would say here's how I will say this is that I think that sometimes my experience and the way that I'm going to talk about something like this may not be the best example, only because now we're 10 years in and clients who seek us out specifically seek us out. Like there's information all over our website about how we do things and why we do them that way. My history with animals, etc. So I think that sometimes I forget that that's a thing because we just don't really see people who just want to use daycare for the sake of using daycare anymore. We just don't have a community of that. But that being said, yes, we have to manage every individual dog coming in and leaving in general, I would say that we don't necessarily see too many dogs who are like really reactive on leash, and their entrance into the space is not directly into other dogs.
Mm.
So they'll come in on a leash, but they're always unleashed and equipment off before they're put in through the next gate and then entered into the actual play group. And I think that that's the only way you can do it is I had a client once describe how I think about like groups of dogs or like being a dog owner or something in general. And they said it's like defensive driving. You have to assume that everybody else is going to do it wrong so that you're always at 100%, always considering safety for yourself and others. And I think that that is the best way to think about managing a group of dogs. You have to assume that every dog has a potential to be, to lunge on leash, to be reactive on leash, only because that's our job. You, as the person who has the dog and takes them home and knows them really well, will probably know their body language differently, will probably manage them differently, have a different relationship with them than we will. But I would say that we do definitely consider like leash reactivity day in and day out, really.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. And the thing that jumped out to me was, having visual barriers so that you're not trying to unleash them and get their equipment off while they're like face to face through a gate with other dogs staring at them, right?
And it's different. Like first thing in the morning, they're excited and amped and stoked to like come in and get treats and pets and play and all that stuff. Towards the end of the day, they're all a little lazier, they've had a long day. There's a lot less amping up that's happening around like 5 or 6 p.m. when everyone's coming to pick up their dogs. So I think it also just varies in that sense too. But yeah, first thing in the morning, they're all reactive on leash in their own way. So if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. Amy, do you have anything you want to add about that?
I think just really shortening that time of frustration, right? So get them off leash quickly, get them in quickly, don't dilly-dally.
Yeah.
I know like with my play groups, when dogs arrive, we have a sort of method to get them in, and they get off lead really fast generally. And they also get off lead all at the same time. So we don't have anyone rushing.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. That was the advice from my mentor when I first started out about reactive dogs. Like, if you were to take a dog to play with another dog, like just get them in quickly.
Yeah, totally.
Drive up to the entrance to wherever the place is and get them right in. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sometimes I have concern about that sometimes because I don't want people to think that we're just like trying to take their dog and then rush them away, but then that also comes with like building a rapport with your clientele is like, you've talked so often, you know that we are, you have a good feeling about the fact that you're leaving your dog with us. So you have been explained this procedure prior to the drop off period. So like, I don't want anybody to ever feel like we're just like, give me your dog and go. But like, it really does. I didn't actually even think about that aspect of it. Really, it just kind of made sense to do it quick and fast, in and out, in and out, in and out. And so I think that is a really important aspect actually. And
yeah, I'm sure it amps the dogs that are already in the daycare up more too.
Yeah.
The dog is taking a long time to get in.
Right? Yeah, big time. Yeah.
So before we move on from daycare, because I want to talk a little bit about other options if your dog is not suitable for daycare. But I just want to make a note about like compassion for daycare providers because I think it's really, really difficult to make a profit to support yourself and also to be ethical. And I know you mentioned that too, Steph, right? Like it's a hard business to be in. And so I do empathize with daycare providers who are doing their best, who are maybe not following protocols that we would recommend, but they want to take more dogs so that they can support themselves.
Look, if you're taking in 150 dogs a day, I'm not judging you, but I feel like you are affording things far better than I will ever be able to. So my compassion lies a little bit differently in different scenarios. Mm-hmm. And again, not judging. Everyone's going to do it however they want to do it. And that's just how things work. But I think that, it's hard to do things with your entire, like, I think you get into tunnel vision at times and you have to be slapped out of it a little bit because you only want to do things as ethically as you can. And then eventually, people start watching to make sure you're only doing things as ethically as you can. And I want to upkeep that as best as I can. But we're also human beings just trying to do, work with live animals, and live animals are not always predictable. So there's just so much compassion and financial intertwining there. And I mean, I'll never be rich doing what I do, and that's okay.
Well, I think there's an expectation that like if you love animals, you shouldn't have to make a living, right?
Yeah. Across the board, I think.
Yeah. And so
Wrong.
it's a tricky line to walk for sure. Okay, so a lot of people listening to this podcast probably have dogs who may not be suitable for daycare, whether their dog is frustrated or fearful or anxious, maybe just like, a full day or even a couple hours straight of dog time is too much for them. So dog walkers, obviously that's the first thing that comes to mind, right? Like assuming that the dog can be left alone for chunks of time while their family is at work. A dog walker may be an alternative. But just like dog training and dog daycares, there's no standard of care for dog walking. Anyone can kind of become a dog walker if they want to. And if we're working with a dog, especially a big dog who has some reactivity issues, that's a safety concern for me, for sure. And so if you have a dog who is reactive, and you're looking for a dog walker, either for a client or yourself, what would you be looking for that dog to make sure that everything is safe and that you're kind of like in line with your training goals when you hand that dog over to the dog walker? Amy, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I would be looking for an individual dog walker that's going to 100% focus on my reactive dog. I think, you can certainly get to the point where a dog walker does a great job with two dogs at the same time, but I'd want to maybe have them focus on my dog first and get to a point where they're comfortable and I'm comfortable before introducing another dog. But, some dogs are not going to want another dog. So individual dog walk would be key, I think. And communication again. So Stefania talked about that for daycare. Communicate with the dog walker. What are your dog's needs? What's going to help them? For example, distance. Can you keep distance from certain triggers? Are you going to let them sniff? A lot of questions and communication with that walker.
Yeah.
And testing as well. I would personally, as a dog guardian, I would go for a walk with them first just to, give them these tips. Okay, this is what my dog needs in these moments, and just do like a practice run.
Mm-hmm. Steph, do you have anything you want to add about that, about dog walking? No.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that, and I think that dog walkers are there's a need for it. Things like where people get help with their animals, people are working longer hours. They're working more than one job. They're doing gigs on the side. They're making stuff for the farmer's market. I don't think that should discount them from having like a companion animal in their lives. And so the best thing that we can do is advocate for our dogs individually. And if you have a reactive dog, I think that you have to take into consideration what's right for your dog. And if you have a dog walker that can help you out with that, I think that's awesome. And, I took our Bruna almost a year and a half to 2 years to actually warm up to her dog walker. But she got to a point where I couldn't walk her with my other dog anymore. I couldn't walk her with an infant. So we had no choice but to finally look into that. And I really wish that I looked into it sooner. And I just thought for the longest time that the financial aspect of it was going to be too challenging for us to manage, and that it wasn't going to be a priority. But honestly, she, I think, had some of her best walks with him, because he did that with us, where we walked around together the first time or two. And then he took his time with her. He didn't have to take her for a walk if she didn't want to be leashed. She just wanted to go in the yard that day. That's all she did. And that was fine for me. So I think it is important to just empower people to just ask questions and work with the provider to make sure that it's right for your individual dog.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you touched on that, because I was gonna make a comment about like dogs who are not comfortable with strangers doing those slow introductions and having multiple meetings and all that kind of stuff. And not every walker is going to be interested or able to do that. There's also walkers who specialize in reactive dogs, or like have special knowledge or training in reactive dogs, but they are few and far between. So it's pretty low likelihood, unless you're in a major kind of urban center, that you're going to find that. If you do have that in your area, you're lucky, I would say, because there's not that many walkers that have that knowledge. That you really want someone that you can trust, that they're going to be able to follow, basic management skills, get out of there if there's a trigger, know how to kind of avoid triggers in a positive manner.
Mm-hmm.
And be able, if the dog does have a slip up and lunges at something, that it's going to be safe and that they're going to be able to handle your dog outside. And that might also mean that, like you mentioned, Steph, like they just like go to the backyard instead of walking your dog. Like maybe they just come and let your dog out to pee and put your dog at home instead of taking them on a walk. I think that's totally legitimate. Your dog still gets attention. They still get to go to the bathroom. There's also walk and train. So some trainers will offer walk and train, where they will literally walk your dog and train them. And again, like with all of these things, we want to make sure that person is kind of in line with the positive reinforcement based methodology, and they're not going to put any tools on your dog without your knowledge. And they're essentially going to support what you are doing with your dog versus doing something completely different. I also think it's important to touch on alternative daycare, because there are people that will watch dogs like in their home. And that might be a better option if you do need care all day, but you don't want to put your dog in a big group facility, that you could potentially find someone who could watch your dog. Maybe they're retired or they work from home and they have dogs just hanging out with them.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just your dog, or maybe it's a couple dogs, right? Instead of the big group. I just want to make sure we're using our time. Actually, I'll touch on boarding very quickly, because I don't think we have enough time to go into like all the details about boarding. But I think it's similar, right? In terms of finding someone suitable for your dog for boarding. Typically with reactive dogs, I probably would recommend trying to find someone who can come to your home, putting them in a kennel. If it's your only option, it's your only option, but it's probably not the ideal option. That dog probably is going to be practicing their reactive behavior in that kennel. And it can be a pretty stressful environment. So I would be looking for someone who could come to your home. If it's someone who could have your dog in their home, that's an option as well. And I would try to find someone, especially if your dog is nervous around strangers, that would be willing to do a few walks with you or meetings, or just making sure that your dog is comfortable with them before you leave them. And Amy, I wanted to talk a little bit about your play groups, because I think that's an alternative for these frustrated dogs that really need an outlet. And so I always try to send clients, if their dog is really frustrated and they're social off leash and they need to get that frustration kind of out of their system by playing with other dogs. I always try to send people to play groups if they don't have a playmate that they can easily kind of access. But obviously that's another situation where we want to make sure they're well managed. So Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about how you run your play groups, and do you have any reactive dogs in your play groups?
I do have a few. I would say they're definitely the frustrated ones. I don't think anxious ones are really suitable at my play group, because of getting there, coming in, that whole process. So yeah, these guys, I just have a few. They are more frustrated. So I guess again for this is duration. So I have been doing this for a while now, and I used to do it for an hour. And I sort of came to the conclusion that was a bit too long, and that most dogs do better with less time. before they need a break, right? And so I'm not doing a daycare, so I don't have like a facility to give them rest. It's just an open field that's fenced. So I dropped it to 45 minutes, and that's working better. Sort of around the 45-minute mark, some dogs will start to do unwanted things, right? So the play will deteriorate because they're starting to get tired. And so we do a maximum of 10 dogs in my adult group. So these are not puppies, they're not adolescent dogs. And then my adolescent is 7 max. Usually it's 6. And then puppies is 4 to 5, young puppies.
And that's with one trainer managing them?
Yes. And sometimes I'll have an assistant, but all my guardians stay. So there's a lot of hands on deck and I'm coaching them. So they're actually very much participating. But if I need my assistant who's more educated and more skilled, then she comes. And then we do assessments, of course. So I will do an assessment first before they can come. But yeah, I think it's a great option for dogs that don't like all day long. You know, they like a little bit of socialization, but they don't want all day long access to other dogs. So I like having the guardians there because it's educational. They're learning a lot about their dogs, about body language and play, and they're really bonding with their dogs. So yeah, it's fun. I love it. But it's a great option if you can find that and your dog isn't a party all day type of dog.
Most of them aren't. So.
Yeah, it's true. Well, that's true. That's very true.
I don't want to party all day every day either. So
yeah,
totally,
especially as they get older, right?
I get
it.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, well, I think that's a great way to end our conversation. But I do think that play group is I'm glad we touched on it because I'm always looking for that for my clients because I have a lot of clients where the dog is frustrated and they would really benefit from some social time, but they don't have a dog that they know that they can throw the dog in with, right? And so we're having to search for how do we meet this need. Thank you so much to you both for joining me this episode. This has been a great conversation, and it will help point many reactive dog guardians in the right direction. For more information on where to find either Amy or Stefania, check out our show notes. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Reactive Dog Pod. Please make sure to subscribe, rate, and review so more reactive dog guardians can find me. If you need help with your reactive dog, I offer one-on-one support, group training, and an online membership, all available virtually worldwide. Information on where to find me is in the show notes for each episode.